This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
Kick off the year of you with Fresh Time's biggest sale. Reset, refresh, and reimagine with 33% off all wellness items department-wide from January 8th through the 14th. Take better care of you this season with savings on everything from sports nutrition and super greens to protein powder, collagen, and the super popular sea moss. Visit your neighborhood Fresh Time and take advantage of this feel-good sale. Fresh Time Market, where healthy living is made easy.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 502, The Wolf is at the Door. Last time, having switched gears to cover the events on Crimea, the 11th German Army was coming fast. Unfortunately for the Russians, unusual for them, they fell for a piece of bad intelligence. Thus, its forces were scattered out on the peninsula, leaving the northern approaches more weakly defended. The question was, would Moscow figure out its mistake before the enemy came knocking on the door? Not that General Eugene Schobert, commander of the German 11th Army, didn't have his own issues. Though the Soviet 9th Army had held him up on the Dnieper River for a week, he was now across, and a part of his army was chasing the annoying 9th Army towards Melitopol, due north of the eastern half of Crimea. And now that he was close to the peninsula, his orders from Berlin kicked in. While he was to take control of the Crimea, he was also under the obligation to support Panzergrupp's drive on Rostov. Thus, after crossing the Dnieper, he had 30th Army Corps and 49th Army Corps continue east to keep moving the Soviet 9th Army away from Crimea's entrance. Meanwhile, General Erich Hansen's 54th Army Corps was to head for the peninsula to open the way at Perekop. Though the Germans, it has to be said, also had their own faulty intelligence, which meant they didn't even know about the newly formed 51st Army that was to help defend the peninsula, and the attacking 11th Army was about to lose its leader. The only intelligence the Germans had at this point was from aerial observation, and General Schobert liked to get his own point of view, so he was up in his stork on September 12th, when he landed to get a closer look at something. What he failed to realize was that he had just landed in a Russian minefield. The plane went over the right or wrong piece of land, and there was an explosion, and so the 11th Army now needed a new commander. That man would be General of Infantry Erich von Manstein, who had conceived the notion of having panzers travel through the Ardennes forest when attacking France. It was hoped that his thoroughness here would work wonders as well. Still, it would take him 5 days to reach the front, and war waits for no man. And it would be that same day, September 12th, that the Germans would learn something of Perekop, the entrance to the Crimea. At 6 a.m., September 12th, a unit from the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division dashed towards Perekop from the Berislav breakthrough. They were to ascertain the strength of the defending units there, but if possible, to take possession. When reaching the village Preobrazhenska, still 5 miles shy of the land bridge, the two German reconnaissance forces pulled up and were immediately fired upon by a 76mm gun from a nearby Soviet armored train. Additionally, Soviet infantrymen started up with their rifles. SS Sturmbannführer Kurt Meyer had some of his men deploy to return fire. Clearly, they would not be taking this village today, but he needed more information before leaving, hence the return fire. Not only was their initial greeting robust, but Meyer could see that far beyond the village there were bunkers, barbed wire, and other Soviet guns. That was enough intel for now. Besides, that 76mm gun was wreaking havoc on his men. They collectively turned around and retreated. By November 17th, the new 11th Army Commander Manstein was close enough to the front to learn a few things. First, the majority of his forces were moving towards Melitopol. Second, that General of the Cavalry Erich Hansen's 54th Army Corps had ordered its 46th and 73rd Infantry Divisions closer to Perekop. And three, those two divisions, for whatever reason, had yet to be ordered to move in and engage to begin wearing down Perekop's defenses. But there was good news. At least the two other semi-land bridges to the immediate east of Perekop, Chonhar Peninsula and Arabat Spit, were occupied by other German forces, but this was more of a preventative, as those land bridges were not continuous, but crossing might be possible here by boat. What Manstein could not know was that during the 5 days it took him to reach his new command, General Kuznetsov, in command of defending Crimea, had rearranged his defenses on the island. Clearly, the threat would be coming from the north, so troops were moved around to reflect this new reality. The next issue for Manstein was getting supplies across the Dnieper, enough to attack Perekop proper. And this was an issue as all the bridges were destroyed and only pontoon crossings were all the Germans had. And lastly, that Colonel Alexander Delenin's 156th Rifle Division had constructed 3 lines of defense along the Perekop Isthmus, but the main line was at a location referred to as the Tatar Wall, an old barrier that the Tatars had used to keep the vengeful Russians out. Now, the Russians were using it to keep them in and the Germans out. Big historical events are like investing goals. A little here, a little there. It adds up. Then something big happens. That's whatever your investing goals are. And that's Acorn's approach. Use your spare change to start investing for your future. And you can earn bonus investments just for buying what you need from brands you love. I've been using Acorns for the last 5 years, and I'm happy. I needed 5 minutes to set it up, and now my future is that much less stressful. After all, a new year is here, so use that as a marker to start something new for you. Again, I have a regular account, a retirement account, and something set up for my 2 youngest daughters. So, to sum up, Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing so your money has a chance to grow for you, your kids, and your retirement. You do not need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. You don't need to be rich. Acorns let you invest with the spare money you've got right now. You can start with $5 or even just your spare change. Again, I've been using this for 5 years and I'm happy, and I genuinely want you to give it a try. Head to acorns.com/WW2 or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Paid client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors, LLC, and SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/WW2. And these 3 lines were something to be reckoned with. The first line the Germans would have to come into contact with when they came this way had 2 rifle battalions along it, supported by 2 artillery battalions. Next, civilian labor was used to dig a 6-foot deep anti-tank ditch located just behind the line. And interspersed among these were 4 lines of barbed wire, meant to entangle and cut legs. The 76mm cannon and the 45mm anti-tank guns were housed in timber and stone bunkers. This was within the main defensive line and would be able to fire on the enemy even as they engaged the first 2 lines. And if none of this stopped the enemy, well, then there was the Tatar Wall with a 36-foot deep and 104-foot wide moat. And with the entire area being open, having no trees, the Germans would be observable and fired upon even before making contact with the first defensive line. And this does not even include the thousands of anti-personnel mines, the 50-kilogram aerial and larger naval bombs set to go off by a tripwire. But the real stressor for the Germans would be the buried flamethrowers, again set up to go off by tripwire. Clearly, Kuznetsov was taking this very seriously, as most Russians only got one chance to fail Stalin. So it will come as no surprise that some of those mines were not filled with explosives, but rather mustard gas. When the Stavka heard about this, they told Kuznetsov, "Don't do that again, unless we tell you to." Much of these defenses Manstein learned from aerial reconnaissance, and it disheartened him. There had to be a better way of setting foot on the peninsula that did not involve thousands of his men dying trying to get through all that hell. So he had Lieutenant Nubling, an engineer, conduct his own detailed reconnaissance. And soon Nubling believed he had found something. Back in 1920, the Red Army had been able to gain entrance to the Crimea by going along its eastern edge through the Savash, a series of shallow lagoons, also called the Rotten Sea, that went across the northern entrance and then down the eastern coast. But just as he was about to report this find back to Manstein, his men stepped into the marsh. The water was only a foot deep, but the sand was so soft they sank down to their waists. Clearly, this was not worthy of reporting. Nubling kept looking. Manstein, not needing this delay, asked Nubling if assault boats could be used to cross the Savash, but the answer was no. And all the bridges in the area, again, had been blown. So Manstein was back to square one. And square one was to be a direct attack. But here, Manstein deserves credit for pulling out all the stops. Anything that he could give to General of the Cavalry, Commander of the 54th Army Corps, Erich Hansen, he did. This included 30th Army Corps' artillery batteries, along with every gun he could get his hands on. Many of these pieces of artillery were Czech or Romanian, but at the end of the day, September 24th, the day of the attack, Hansen would have 152 pieces. Plus, his 2 infantry divisions were back up to full strength, thanks to recently arrived replacements. Lastly, Manstein, who really needed this to work, kept a part of the SS Adolf Hitler Division in reserve. They would be turned loose once the opening was created. The man in charge of planning the artillery support of the infantry attack was General Lieutenant Johann Zuckertorp, a Mischling, or half-breed, one half being Jewish. In order to stay in the army, he had to carry around on his person a blood certificate, personally signed by Hitler. And as his brother had already been removed from the army for his less than enthusiastic support of the new regime, Johann was most desirous to do well. At 5 a.m. on September 24th, Zuckertorp's guns started going off. Thousands of shells were slamming into the initial Soviet defensive line. However, overhead, between Fliegerkorps 4's contributions and the Soviet Naval Air Force, the battle above was pretty much a draw. At 7:30 a.m., the German infantry moved out. First came Major General Kurt Himmer's 46th Infantry Division, 5 battalions strong, supported by 2 centimeter flat guns, Panzerjägers, or self-propelled anti-tank guns, and a battery of Stug 3 assault guns. Behind them and to their left would be Lieutenant General Bruno Bieler's 73rd Infantry Division. The 46th, the one going in first, were made up of men who joined before the war. The 73rd Division was mostly reservists. At the very tip of the 73rd Infantry's attack was Oberlieutenant Otto Hitzfeld and his regiment, 213. Their goal was to storm the Cherjany-Chaban State Farm, and some of the bullets that had fired on the German reconnaissance when they had first shown up had come from this state farm. Defending the state farm was Captain Ivashan and his 2 battalions from the 361st Regiment. They had plenty of ammunition and were behind piles of nearby items, moved to make a wall. Still, the German engineers went in, and though suffering heavy losses, did create a breach. Next, smoke grenades were thrown in by the Germans at and to both sides of the breach as Hitzfeld's men kept coming in. While the 2 sides fought, sometimes hand-to-hand, other attackers used flamethrowers and charges to reduce bunkers. And in this fashion, the Soviet battalion was eventually wiped out. The state farm was taken, The last straw, as Soviet reinforcements were on the way, was a bomb run by Ju-88s. They kept the other defenders away. And by the end of the day, yes, the Germans had achieved a bridgehead, but they had lost 770 men, including 4 company commanders. Meanwhile, 46th Division, attacking a bit to their east, lost 329 men. Thus, the equation was 1,100 men lost to take 1 defensive line. And there were still 2 more to go, and one of them was the main defensive line, where casualties were expected to be even higher. Factoring this in, and hoping to fight smarter, not harder, Manstein then had the 22nd Infantry Division, with a part of the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, make moves at Chonhar and the Sivash. But Kuznetsov would see this for what it was, a diversion only. But at least now Kuznetsov knew for a fact where the threat was coming from. So he had a regiment from the 106th Rifle Division, elsewhere on the peninsula, come north to fill the hole that the fighting on the 24th had created. The next morning, September 25th, General of the Cavalry Hansen sent his men back in to add on to the previous day's gains. And here, the Germans excelled. Their assault groups, though based on an infantry battalion, also had a pioneer platoon, which normally went in first, a unit of assault guns, and a platoon of 2-centimeter flat guns. The Soviet guns, however, were numerous and laid down a withering fire, but the assault group kept coming. And though the Soviet machine guns cut down approaching Germans time and again, the second line was breached. Soon after, the assault group, or Stossgruppen, reached the main line at the Tatar Wall. Seeing the inevitable, Colonel Delenin decided to alter the future by sending in his own attack to spoil what the Germans were trying to do. Those about to go in would be the men from the 530th Regiment, plus the 5th Tank Regiment. But however it happened, the Tank Regiment's commander, Baranov, only sent in his T-37 and T-40 light tanks, holding on to his 10 T-34s. They had all just arrived days before, and perhaps there was the idea of these might be the last tanks we see for a while, so the heavier tanks were held back. So going back to the Soviet counterattack, missing T-34s, it came to nothing. The German Panzerjägers certainly made sure of that. And other good news for the Germans, as they had focused their attack more, they only lost 322 men on this second day of battle, whereas Delenin lost almost 1/3 of his infantry.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply.
General Hansen, sensing victory, decided to throw everything he had at the Tatar Wall during the morning of September 26th. This included an artillery barrage that used up most of his remaining supplies, and there were attacks by Ju-87 Stukas, and fighters strafed as well. Being honest with himself, Hansen knew that his 2 divisions were exhausted, but, he was hoping, so were the remaining men of Delenin's 156th Rifle Division. After a few hours of artillery to soften up the defenders, smoke grenades were thrown in, and at 9 a.m. the assault squads threw themselves at the wall. First, the pioneers reached the ditch and used boards to climb up to reach the top. And once they reached the top of the dirt wall, they were met with barbed wire, which cut into their skin. But with bullets whizzing over their heads, this pain was relative. To stop this flood of attackers, Soviet infantry threw grenades over the dirt wall and down into the ditch the Germans were trying to climb out of. This delivered heavy pioneer casualties, but again, they did not stop coming. Some of these men were from SS units, and thus fanatics, and that should not be ignored. And before the Soviet grenades could have a chance to turn the tide of battle, a German machine gunner reached the top himself with his own weapon, and he opened up on the enemy. This forced the Soviets to keep their heads down and ruined their opportunity to keep throwing grenades accurately. With this being the case, the Germans came on, as their mixed units worked well together, offering offensive and defensive qualities as needed. And in this vein, the Soviet 361st Rifle Regiment, still relatively fresh, was reduced. At 10:30 a.m., the back of the defense was broken. Just west of Fort Perekop, several assault groups broke through there as well. The Soviet mortar and anti-tank positions simply did not have time to fire fast enough to stop the invaders. Hitzfeld's men ran past these defenders, firing point-blank at them, all the while staying on the move, and they even managed to go a little bit south and take the town of Armyansk, just below or south of the Tatar Wall. What came next was house-to-house fighting and a struggle over the town's brick factory. By 11 a.m., the Germans were past the Tatar Wall in force. Kuznetsov ordered Bantov's operational group of 3 rifle regiments to counterattack, again hoping to spoil the Germans' plans. And despite having no artillery support, Bantov led his men, and they managed to force back the 46th Infantry, back to the Tatar Wall. As for Hitzfeld's men, they were pushed out of Armyansk by 2 p.m. But then, between a heavy Luftwaffe attack and a borrowed assault group from 50th Division just arrived from Odessa, the Germans went forward again. This time, the Soviet troops at Armyansk were pushed all the way out. When the sun went down, the Russians only held an eastern part of the Tatar Wall. They had no reserves left in the area, and it seemed, if the Germans started up their attack again the next day, the next defending force at Ishun, some 20 kilometers to the south, would not be able to successfully resist either. Where Berlin was happy to see the Tatar Wall breached so quickly, Moscow had the opposite reaction. Thus, they ordered Kuznetsov to simply attack, attack, attack. Desperate, Kuznetsov explained to Bantov that not only did Crimea hang in the balance, but probably also their lives. So Bantov went in with his men on the morning of September 27th with a will. The Germans, caught off guard by this intensity, were pushed mostly back to the Tatar Wall, and a part of Armyansk was retaken. But then some of the Germans rushed to the brick factory to hold up there. This was on the northern edge of Armyansk. And it was here that these German pioneers held out against numerous attacks that day. Moreover, Pioneer Battalion 173 had started constructing a 16-ton bridge across the western end of the Tartar Ditch. It wasn't their best work, but it allowed several Stug 3 assault guns to cross. To be sure, Soviet artillery killed many of the pioneers, 118 of them to be exact, but they kept working. As the day wore on, the Soviets exhausted themselves with their counterattacks. So, just before the sun set, men from the German 50th Infantry Division, supported by those assault guns, stormed ahead and retook most of the town of Armyansk. Bantov could not let this be, so the next day, September 28th, he took what he had left and he threw them in. The Germans were pushed back, and some of their T-34s reached the Tatar Wall. Kuznetsov reported this latest, though limited, success to the Stavka, but he also told them, "I have no more reserves. If the Germans should come again," the Germans attacked the town in the dying sunlight and retook Armyansk. Kuznetsov got back on the radio and asked for permission to retreat to Ishun. The Stavka let Kuznetsov know, in no uncertain terms, that they were most displeased, but then agreed to his withdrawal. And this is where the T-34s really showed their stuff. As the Soviet infantry pulled back, taking what equipment they could, the T-34s kept the Germans back. And not only did the Soviets reach Ishun, they only lost one T-34 during fighting that lasted several days. But just as Hansen was about to give the order to charge on the Ishun position and thus gain true entrance to the peninsula, The troops of the Soviet Southern Front attacked the Romanians just west of Melitopol, again to the north, creating a crisis there. Why Romanians, who had been in support roles up to this point? In order to attack Perekop, Manstein had taken Munch from 30th Army Corps and given it to Hansen. The Soviets figured this out, and just as the Tatar Wall was being breached for the first time, the Southern Front launched its own attack to the north. To help stem this new tide, Manson now had to take the SS Adolf Hitler Division, an assault gun unit, and most of the planes of Fliegerkorps 4 from the peninsula and take them to the north. The result would be the Battle of the Sea of Azov. And though Russia would lose the 9th and 18th Armies during this week-long struggle, a week was given to the peninsula. Mars, the god of war, takes away with one hand, but gives with the other. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So I hope you had a Merry Christmas or however you celebrate it. Let's see here. As far as new members, I would like to thank Christopher Taylor for coming on board. Let's see, he is from Fairy Meadows, New South Wales, Australia. Thank you very much, Christopher. And as far as donations, Joseph Whitfield. Thank you very much, Joseph. I do greatly appreciate it. We'll stick with the peninsula for a little while, bring it up to speed, and then hit north, and then just kind of try to push all three fronts at the same time, whichever way they go, just to get a smooth narrative. So we'll see how it works out. But just know that these are the battles that end up, gutting the German army to allow the Soviets, once they really get going when they ramp up with more tanks and planes and guns and everything, they're able to push their way back. But these are the battles that allows that to happen, and they cannot be ignored. Take care, everyone.